Hello, everybody. Today I will be presenting on an article called A More Sustainable Supply Chain. It is by the Harvard Business Review. So first, it's important to understand, what does an unsustainable supply chain look like? And this looks like poor environmental standards, chronic overtime, lack of systematic accident reporting, dangerous working conditions, exploitation of child labor, hostile work environments, and lack of transparency, just to name a few um, characteristics of an unsustainable supply chain. Now, what this article that I read did do was conduct a study of 3 supply networks, each headed by a multinational corporation considered to be a sustainability leader. Industries in which these MNCs were involved in included automotive, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, though unnamed from the brand perspective. Study also includes a representative set of each of the MNC suppliers, a total of 9 top tier and 22 lower tier. Top tier meaning your more direct suppliers, your lower tier meaning the supplier of your suppliers, bleeding all the way down to, the nuts and bolts of your product. The suppliers were based out of Mexico, China, Taiwan, and the US. What this study did find was that, so within Mexico, they studied 5 lower tier suppliers, and they found that all lacked environmental management systems, whether it was a lack of environmental procedures and monitoring standards, as well as procedures, or just dumping toxic waste into rivers, or producing too much carbon dioxide, or just what have you, just a lack of environmental management systems. 4 of the lower tier suppliers lacked procedures for handling red flag social problems, such as sexual harassment or supervisor retaliation. There's just lack of procedures there. With regards to China and Taiwan, they studied 10 lower suppliers, and all of which had marginal environmental practices similar to Mexico, and they had dangerous working conditions and chronic overtime issues. With regards to the US, 7 lower tier suppliers were studied, found that 3 had high concentrations of airborne chemicals and lack of systematic accident reporting, meaning that there was a dearth of smooth and operating procedures for employees to just report any accidents or mishaps while experiencing their work. As far as a more sustainable model firms who encourage sustainability, I put that in quotations, meaning that the MNCs are the leaves in this case. They're the pretty front end, the brand name, the big brand name, the nice product, etc. But meaning that the supply networks aren't always the case. They aren't always as environmentally friendly, aren't always as giving and compassionate towards their employees. So the roots underneath the product in the MNC aren't always as clean as the MNC might appear. Consequences of having a unsustainable supply network or just having bad practices is damage to local ecosystems. I mean, if you dump toxic waste into your river, or have too much carbon dioxide in the air, or what have you, there is damage to the local ecosystems, meaning that the animals, the plants, the habitats surrounding are damaged. There's brand and reputation degradation, meaning that, like, if you have some lower tier suppliers who aren't necessarily practicing the way they should be, your brand is still associated with them. So therefore your brand is degraded, and therefore in the minds of consumers less valuable. And so there's what that leads to: loss of customers and revenue. And in some cases you may be forced to find new suppliers because they don't necessarily want to associate with your MNC or your firm. And then of course this could lead to supply chain disruption, which leads to potentially lack of production, not meeting goals, and just not performing the standard. And I think it's imperative to involve both your first tier and your lower tier suppliers in your sustainability practices and your planning going forward, so everybody has a clear idea of what the standards are and clear communication. Key drivers for these MNCs and their lack of sustainability standards is, of course, profit. It really helps out helps out the bottom line if you cut corners. I mean, it takes money to implement the right amount of training, the right amount of staff, the developing the right amount of standards, and putting enough thought into that costs money. And so it's easier to cut corners. MNC demands, meaning this problem usually starts at the top, meaning when the MNC has large demands, they want to meet a big order in a timely fashion. They want to deliver for a big client, this could strain the manufacturing process and the employees. And so this problem usually starts at the top, meaning MNCs need to be more considerate of their capacity. There's a lack of accountability. Most MNCs are still trying to beef up their own sustainability standards, so there's a lack of care for the people that they associate with, their lower tier suppliers, in which they're just too focused inward, if that makes sense. And of course, there's little incentives and training. All of the 52 procurement officers did report that there was little incentives and training, and they do not have sufficient incentives or training to carry on the sustainability practices in which the MNC demands of them. Best practices, these three MNCs that are considered sustainability leaders, they had established long-term sustainability goals. They required their first tier suppliers to set their own long-term sustainability goals, so it's not just them. And they included their lower tier suppliers in the overall sustainability strategy. So like I previously mentioned, we all have a clear picture of how we're going to approach this issue, and we are moving in the same direction and not against each other. And of course, or not of course, but they did task a person on staff with extending the firm's sustainability program to first and lower tier suppliers. Some strategies to encourage good practices. You can get involved directly, meaning that you can evaluate your suppliers by using sustainability performance indicators that capture the requirements for lower tier suppliers. Whatever these performance indicators you come up with, just evaluate them using them. You can also survey suppliers on their environmental, health, safety, and labor practices and their procurement practices. You could also work with major first-tier suppliers and map out the supply network so we know where it all leads and there's no stone unturned. Indirect ways, you could provide training and foster peer learning. You could select high-performing suppliers to pilot new sustainability initiatives, and you could reward suppliers for cascading sustainability requirements to lower-tier suppliers. From the collective perspective, you can commit to developing and complying with industry-wide sustainability standards and help suppliers become full members of industry organizations. Via industry organizations, you could share resources with competitors and major suppliers to achieve sustainability goals. And then, of course, you could encourage first and lower tier suppliers to take advantage of sustainability training programs offered by industry organizations. And from the global perspective, you can work closely with relevant NGOs and international institutions, use tools and data that these orgs provide for dealing with suppliers, such as contracts and scorecards. You could recognize suppliers that excel in these programs sponsored by NGOs and international institutions as well. So the first tier suppliers are in a tough spot because regardless, they have pre-approved suppliers that they must work with, and they are held accountable if those companies mistreat workers or harm the environment. As one exasperated manager said while describing this conundrum in the article, they said, "I am just using the supplier you asked me to use," frustrated. And so there's just a lack of accountability for the rest of the network. And so this degrades their brand, this degrades their reputation. And this begs the question, how can we hold lower tier suppliers more accountable? I present this question to those watching. I'm curious on what you guys think and how we could better hold lower tier suppliers more accountable to these sustainability issues. Critical actions, these are things that we must do going forward. You must set convergent sustainability goals and align incentives for all functions that interact with first and lower tier suppliers. You must ensure that we are approaching these officials and these employees correctly and consistently. There's just different agendas when approaching some of these suppliers, the first and lower tier suppliers. So we just make sure that we have alignment with our incentives and such. You can increase the sustainability training and incentives for procurement officers. Obviously, if you incentivize them, there's more likelihood that they'll follow the standards themselves. So make sure that we are focusing on that triple bottom line, meaning people, profit, and planet. And so there must be sufficient training and incentives in place. And then you can improve the communications with the first tier and the lower tier procurement personnel, as mentioned previously. And this begs the question, how can we improve the communication with first tier suppliers? And what I would say, I'm thinking is you potentially put on a chief sustainability officer in which they would They would have some sense of idea of how we should move as a group and establish and maintain communications. You can coordinate the development, monitoring, and enforcement of collective sustainability standards and research and initiate new methods to improve the triple bottom line. I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching. Many multinational corporations sincerely want to embed fair labor practices and environmental responsibility throughout their supply networks, but a good way to start is by adopting the sustainability strategies used by these three MNCs in the study. But all corporations can and should do more. They should send their suppliers and their procurement officials a more consistent message that economic, social, and environmental requirements are all important, and create new incentives for them to pursue not just economic goals, but social and environmental as well. Take on a hands-on approach, collecting data about the supplier's capacity, monitoring indicators of their sustainability performance, and engaging with them through continuous improvement projects. And of course, work with all parties to cascade and disseminate the best practices around the organization and make sure that our organizational framework is as conducive as can be to spread information to best support our sustainability goals. Thank you for watching.